Hello and welcome to the panel discussion for Business Studies A-Level. My name is Yasas. I am from Center for Higher Secondary Education.
Myself Dilip. I am representing Ahmadiyya International School.
Okay, so I'm sure you have already gone through the TV discussion that we had the other day about market positioning and market mapping. So based on the TV session that you have already watched, we have some good questions that the students have asked, which we are going to discuss today. So if we are to quickly recap of what you saw on TV earlier on the subject, we talked about the definition of market mapping and the definition of market positioning to start with, and then we talked about why companies do market positioning, and then we talk about what are the importance of product differentiation and how the product differentiation is carried out by the organizations, and then we talk about market mapping and how the market mapping will be useful and what are the limitations of market mapping for a business in order to find a particular gap in the consumer's mind. Right. So based on these, we have a couple of questions. So the first question that we have is, what are the main uses of market mapping?
Yeah, the main use of market mapping is to identify a gap in the market. For every business, it is important to identify a gap and position their products in the gap.
That's right. So if we talk about the specific definitions in this case, what are the definitions we can talk about as the importance of the benefits of market mapping?
So that's what the first benefit would be, to identify the gap and to position their product or their service in the gap.
That's right. And then
moreover, we can also differentiate the product with those of competitors.
That's right. And also we could talk about the identified gap will be useful in order to position the product successfully, like Dilip said.
Yes.
And also we can identify where the business is in relation to the other businesses or the competitors in the market, thanks to conducting a market map. I think those things we have already discussed, but there is a question about those usefulness of market mapping. So keep in mind, the biggest benefit of market mapping is to find a gap in the consumer's mind, right?
Yes, that's right.
So once a company or once an organization finds a gap in the consumer's mind, that gap could be useful for a business to effectively position the product in the consumer's mind so that they could reach the product differentiation as what the companies are trying to look for. Exactly. So that is why that is what the main benefit or the reason why companies should do market mapping. Yeah. And then the second question that we have got from the students, of course, is the opposite of the previous question.
Yeah, yes.
The limitations.
Yes. The market mapping has got a lot of limitations, even though it has got a lot of advantages. One of the limitation is we can use only two variables at a time.
That's right.
Since market mapping is a two-dimensional map, we can use only two variables. Mostly price and quality is a two main variable use, but it is not always the same every time.
Right.
So it depends on the market, it depends on the business.
That's right. Now that is why we always talk about the importance of understanding the context in the case study. We will talk about some of the questions, one of the previous questions from the new IAL paper. So keep in mind that it is important for you to always think about the context of the organization. So even though we say price and quality as the two common variables that we could use for market mapping, it's not conclusive. Yes. Because depending on the organization, depending subjective. On the case study, we can change different or we can use different dimensions. So apart from the issue of having only two dimensions, what else students can write in the answer?
Other limitations of market mapping includes every gap doesn't gives an opportunity for the business.
Exactly.
Because market mapping, it depends on opinions. It is a lot of researches are conducted. Based on the researches only, we are doing the market map.
So it's all about how people perceive the market.
The market.
So different people might perceive the
Yes.
market in a different way, so that there won't be any specific things that we can come up with.
Yes.
So I think we did talk about that in the discussion as well. I took the example of price and quality, and an obvious example for a problem or where we say that just because there is a gap does not necessarily mean that there is a demand is for high price, low quality. Now obviously if you do a market mapping based on high price and low quality, there would obviously be a gap, because nobody as a consumer, we even would not
Yes.
want to buy a product by paying a high price if we perceive the quality is
So
lower.
it's not advisable to position a product in that gap.
That's right. So there would be a huge gap there.
Yeah, there would be a huge
Because
gap. Obviously,
no
there
one
would
would be doing that as
Yes.
a business organization whose fundamental objective is to make profit.
Right.
But even though there is a gap like that, it would not necessarily mean that there would be a demand.
demand.
Right. What else we can talk about as the limitations of market mapping?
Another thing, since market research needs to be done, the new businesses entering into a market, they may not be able to afford to conduct a market research because it's costly.
Yeah. Particularly, like I said in the explanation, this may not be possible for a small business, but
Yes.
when you are talking about writing in context, now if you recollect in your 2019 October past paper, the question was on Emirates.
Yeah.
Right? So this might not be a problem for Emirates,
Emirates.
because Emirates, we know it's a world leading airline. So they would have huge amount of money that they could conduct market mapping or market research or whatever as and when they want. But think about a new business, a new entrepreneurial startup. They might not have enough resources. Money
Yeah.
in particular, to conduct this kind of a market mapping. So to conduct a market research, so that they might not be able to, or it might be costly for them to conduct this kind of a market research in order to do market mapping, which could be something that we can write as a limitation.
So
but
they have to conduct a cost benefit analysis before doing the
that's right.
market map.
So this could be a point that keep in mind that we can only write if the case study is about a new organization
Yes.
or a startup business. But if it is an established business, it might not be a point, because like we said, Emirates, for example, if you look at that past paper question, it would not be a problem for Emirates, right? Okay, so moving on to the next question. The next question that we have received is, what is the best approach a business may use to position its product?
There is no best approach actually. It depends upon the market and the situation of the market and also the business.
That's right. I think the whole objective of market positioning and market mapping is to, the whole objective is to reach product differentiation, so
Yes.
that they could try to make their product to be seen different from the rivals. So if we talk about a particular approach, or if we talk about a way to position, I think we talked about some of the approaches how the product differentiation can be achieved, right? Like we talked about in the previous session, the benefits that the product is going to offer, or about a unique selling point. The organization could always talk about the unique selling point. Like for example, in the case of BMW, they talk about their engineering superiority and superior performance.
Yeah, in the case of Toyota, it could be the quality they offer.
That's right. So likewise, they could talk about a unique selling point in order to try and differentiate the product from the rivals. And also they could talk about some characteristics. Now we all talk about Apple phones having a unique iOS as one of the best softwares, or the user friendliness of an Apple phone that provides a quality and a particular characteristic to differentiate the product from the rivals, as well as the origin of the product. Like we talk about Swiss chocolates. We talk about Japanese cars. We talk about Ceylon tea. Right? So they are, when you say the particular country of origin, for example, that itself gives a sort of a product differentiation that could be useful for effective positioning. So I think if we ask the question about the best approach, like Dilip
Conclusively,
said,
there is no best approach. It depends
That's
on the
right.
business.
there is no such best approach that we can say that a company could use in order to position the product. But since the final objective of positioning is to achieve product differentiation, those points that we have just highlighted can be the approaches that companies could look for product differentiation through which they could achieve market positioning. Yes, right. So I think we already have answered the next question that we
That
have.
is importance of product differentiation.
That's right.
We have already answered
we already
that.
talked about that, or we have given the answer to the question about what is the importance of product differentiation. The very reason why companies try to position a product in a particular way in the consumer's mind is to reach or to achieve product differentiation. So that is the answer that we can once again tell you, that why companies or why product differentiation is important is because the companies would position in order to achieve the product differentiation, so that it could give them a sort of a competitive advantage. Okay, so then let's move on to the next question. Why is market mapping less important to large businesses? I think it's a quite interesting question. How can we talk about the importance of market mapping to a large company, and along with that, of course, we can even talk about how it might be useful for a small business as well, right?
So large businesses, they are already established. So they have already positioned their product. But they can use it for repositioning the existing products which they have already positioned in the market.
No.
Maybe due to some reasons, maybe for example due to lack of demand, they may have to reposition the existing product to a new area in the market, in a gap. So for this purpose they can use market mapping.
Or if there's a change in the competition.
Yes, if there is a change in the competition.
So for a large business, I think the answer that we can give is, if it is about repositioning,
due to many reasons. It can be because of a new competitor entering into the market, or if in any case it affect the demand. If we need to reposition, they can use market mapping. They have to do a market mapping
and to identify a gap to position. Otherwise, for an established business like you said, which is already been positioned in the market, I don't think it might be that important, right? And similarly, if we ask the question, even though it is not there in the question, like why small businesses, we already have talked about, for small businesses, they need to try and set a foot in the market.
Yes.
So in order to establish themselves, in order to create a particular perception in the consumer's mind, this would be quite important for a small business, or for a new business rather.
Yes.
For that, market positioning and market mapping can be useful. Okay. Then we have another question. Can we use more than 2 dimensions or 2 variables when constructing a market map?
Well, it's one of the major limitations that we have already discussed. At a time, a market map can be drawn only with 2 variables or 2 dimensions. Since it is a 2-dimensional map, we can use only 2 variables there.
But when you say that 2 variables, at a time we can use 2 different types of variables, or if you develop different market maps, those different market maps we can use
different variables.
Yes. Like I think we talk about that in the teaching session as well. Like Dilip also mentioned that one of the common, 2 of the common dimensions that we use are price and quality. But it's not conclusive to use price and quality depending on the organization. We could use high volume versus low volume, or whether it's a luxury or a necessity, or whether it is a simple versus a complex product, right? Or we could even talk about the usage like family, or perhaps entertainment, or luxury. So there could be different dimensions, different combinations the companies can use depending on how they want to identify the gaps in the consumer's mind. Okay, so so the answer is there is no specific aspect, or there is no specific numbers that we can use as a combination, but at a time for each market map we can only use
Two
two
variables,
dimensions, two variables, so two dimensions, but those the combination that we can select for creating different market maps can vary depending on the requirements of the organization. Yes. Okay. So then we have the next question. How do we choose which two dimensions to map?
Yeah, well, so that's a good question, I think. Since at a time we can use only two dimensions, it is really important to choose the key two dimensions. So it's like we have to think in the perspective of a customer. What is more important for the customer? So that is one reason why we use price and quality commonly, because price and quality is one of the major concern of almost all the consumers.
Yeah.
So it depends on what is important for the customer. So in that way we have to choose two dimensions.
So the company has to look from the customer's point of view in order to determine what two dimensions that they are going to use. So whatever the company feels that as the appropriate two dimensions, they would be able to select, right? Yes. Okay. So the next question, how reliable market mapping is in positioning a product and to analyze competition?
Again, a limitation of market mapping. It depends on the accuracy of market research data we get.
Yeah.
And we know that there is a chance of market research data can get biased. So if those data get biased, then market mapping also won't be reliable.
Because the data that we use will be not accurate, meaning that the market map we are trying to come up would also be not accurate.
Not accurate. Okay. So we have to look into other things like the strategies of the competitors. Actually, market mapping that shows only a snapshot of the present market condition.
Scenario, yes.
Yeah. So we have to consider other aspects also. Cannot completely rely on market mapping while positioning.
I think that is why we say that it has to be substantiated with market research, or we have to look at some other factors like the company's strategy, the competitor's strategy, the economic conditions in the country or in the market. So all these
many external as well as some internal factors like leadership.
Yeah. So these things together should be taken into consideration. So that is why we need to understand that by market mapping itself, the company would not be able to come up with an accurate understanding how to position the product.
So final judgment cannot be made only on the basis of market
map. Right. So then we have a next question. Does a gap in a market may always means there is an opportunity?
Well, a gap in the market could mean that there is an opportunity, but not always. Because as you mentioned earlier, high price, low quality. There will be a gap obviously. But we can't advise any business to position their product in that gap.
Because like we said, no customer would be willing to buy a product at a high price
and have low
where
quality.
they consider the quality is low. So now once again, this could be a good point where you can highlight from the context of the case study or the context of the organization given, because this might be just an example that we have highlighted how we could say that just because there is a gap does not necessarily mean that there is no demand or there is a demand. So you have to look at it from the organization or the case study given to identify how you could relate. Or this is where the application comes in, or this is where we talk about the importance of application in a case study, where you have to understand how you could take an example like this from the given case study and then to apply this so that you have the right application in your answer. So the simple point is, not always there would be a demand or there would be a potential to position a product just because there is a gap in the market. So the example that we wanted you to understand is high price, low quality.
quality.
But when you write in your exam, suppose you write that as a limitation, as a disadvantage of market mapping, make sure you apply it appropriately to the given case study and write this answer. Okay. And then I think that gives a good link to the next question that we are going to discuss. How questions will be asked from this topic in IAL?
So the questions that are commonly asked in IAL can be assess questions, or it can be discuss questions, or it can be analyze questions.
Or even a definition question.
A definition question also. Yeah. So, analyze question, it will be like analyze any two benefits of market mapping, or it can be even explain two benefits or explain two limitations of market mapping, or it can be an assess question, assess the usefulness of market mapping for a business such as so and so.
Yeah.
So, those are the areas where questions are asked from market mapping.
Yeah. So, with that we can go to this question that we have from the 2019 October Edexcel question from Unit 1. Assess the extent to which market mapping may have been useful to Emirates in growing its business. So, now you can see that the case study in that, or the part of that case study has come from Emirates, the famous airline company.
Established business.
That's right. And the question is an evaluative question because the command word is assess the extent to which. So, which means that it is not a one-sided question that you have to answer. It is an evaluative question where you need to talk about both analysis and evaluation. So, the question is assess the extent to which market mapping may have been useful to Emirates in growing its business. And this question has come for 10 marks question, which means that the students will have to write a judgment as well. So, what is the best approach that we could write an answer for this kind of a question?
So, since we have to always start with the knowledge, the key term here is market mapping.
Yeah.
So, we have to start the answer with the understanding of the key term, that is market mapping. And then the context should be there throughout the answer.
That's right.
While giving the analysis as well as in the evaluation. So, in the analysis, you can discuss about the advantages or the usefulness of market mapping for Emirates.
And most importantly, you have to write those advantages from the context of the case study. So, what advantages can we discuss from Emirates' point of view, how it would contribute to the growth of its business?
Emirates also facing a lot of competition now. There are a lot of new entries into the airline industry.
Especially the budget airlines.
Budget airlines are there. So, they can, they may need to reposition their existing services. Maybe a new route or some other services they can add to the existing services. For this, they have to find a gap in the market. So, they can use market mapping for this. They can identify a gap and they can reposition their existing services to that gap.
And I think apart from that, it would help them to see the current level of competition. Like you said that airline industry is one of the most competitive industries in the world, especially with the current economic conditions, plus with the entrance of the budget airlines to the industry. So, I think it would be useful for Emirates to try and see where the competition is so that they could identify how they could go away from the competition or what kind of applications that or what kind of services or
how they could stand out of
destinations that they could use in order to stand out of the competition. I think there are some application in the case study where they have started a new route to Phnom Penh, which is in Cambodia, which is a good example how they might have identified the current competition as well as the gap so that they could try to position themselves or they try to make use of that gap in order to get an advantage for them. And also I think the case study talks about some new entertainments being added or some new entertainment facilities being added could have also been as a result of a gap that they might have seen from the market map Yeah. So likewise, make sure you always highlight those points from the context of the case study, from the organization's point of view. That is what we call application. So even if your answer is a perfect answer in terms of theory, you would not be able to go to the higher level marks unless there is proper application. Any other benefit that we can talk about apart from these two?
The other benefits, it would give an insight about what competitors are providing, and maybe they can prepare some strategies.
Yeah, as a result of whatever they have identified from the market map. Okay, so that is the basically that part is what we call the analysis.
Analysis,
right?
yes.
Right. So since, like I said at the beginning, this question is about an evaluative question because it says assess the extent to which.
Yes.
So this is the part that the students need to write as the analysis
part.
And then the students need to go for
The evaluation.
So now that we have talked about some of the importance of market mapping, how it can contribute to the growth of Emirates from the analysis point of view, how we could talk about the evaluation.
Evaluation, we have to start with the limitations of market mapping for this Emirates.
For Emirates, yeah. So I think the first point we can always highlight is that one that we have been talking about quite several times about just because there is a gap
doesn't mean that there is an opportunity.
Doesn't mean. Now, okay, now the question is how are we to apply? Now we talked about the example of price and quality and that is a general example, right? So if we are to apply from the Emirates point of view, I think the best way that students can talk about is there may be some destinations that seem to be beneficial or advantageous, but why they might not fly.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes.
So just like how we talk about that price and quality to explain the point that why we say that just because there is a gap does not necessarily mean that there is a demand. If we are to apply or to contextualize from an airline's perspective, you could write the point that there may be some destinations that Emirates may find attractive, but they might not fly into. Why? Because there may not be much demand. Or there may be some other factors like maybe a war is happening, or maybe there may be certain threats to the security, or there may be problems.
Maybe other mode of transportation will be
That's right. There may be other stronger mode of transportation like maybe railroad or maybe the other kind of inland transport. Yes. So that is how we could think about the application of the question to the answer or to the case study. So you could say that there may be some some destinations that Emirates may seem to be, or they may consider as advantageous or maybe lucrative, but they might not want to because there may not be a demand. Right? So what else we can talk about as the limitations in the evaluation?
The limitations for Emirates is, as we have already discussed, it's been an established business. They can use only for repositioning their existing services.
If they continue the same services, the market positioning might not be of use. Right. Any other? I think you talked about the snapshot.
The snapshot,
Earlier also we talked about that. It only provides the snapshot of what is
present
happening right now. So as a business, you know that we not only should look at what is happening right now, we also should look at how they would be useful or what they are going to do in the future. So that's where we talked about that how the company strategy and all these things might also be useful in order to understand about the positioning. So the market map only shows just a snapshot of the current position of the product. Okay. So now that I think we have discussed a couple of drawbacks, what could be a good judgment that we could come up with into this kind of an answer? And I think another point we could say is that it might not guarantee success for a business.
It might not guarantee success for the business.
It would be a combination of several things, right?
Yes.
So can we write that sort of a point as a judgment? Because the question is about the growth of Emirates.
Yeah, yes. For a growth of Emirates, there are a lot of other aspects we need to consider. There are many internal as well as external factors that would aid the growth of a business.
What are those kind of factors that we can link to the case study? If you think about some external and internal factors, I think leadership
It could be.
from a good point,
Yeah.
from an internal point of view,
The economic condition
economic conditions,
from an external point of view.
strategies of the
Strategies
competition.
of the competition.
So these could be the points to say as a judgment that the success or the growth
Yes.
may not entirely depend on a market mapping, because a business to be successful from an overall point of view is important for them to look at
The
other
aspects.
factors, like he mentioned about the internal as well as some external. But don't stop there. Now when you write this kind of an answer, don't stop there saying internal and external aspect. It would be a generic answer.
Yes.
So you need to apply, you need to relate it to the case study. That's why he said that throughout the answer it has to be in the context of the case study. Therefore, you can't, even when you write the judgment, you can't just write saying that it all depends on internal and external factors, not just on the market mapping. You need to relate to some of these internal and external factors that the business may have to consider. So that is where we talk about some of the examples like the leadership of the company, the financial position, the financial strength, internal factors, and then from the external point of view, economic influences, the strategies of the competitors. So likewise, these can be some of the examples of external factors which you need to write from the context of the case study point of view when you are writing a judgment. So keep in mind, for the 10 marks question of this kind of unit 1 and unit 2, for this kind of a 10 marks question, it is important for you to write a proper judgment if you are to get the full marks, because you know that Edexcel would be going through the level based marking for this kind of evaluative questions. So to go into the higher level of level 4, which is the maximum marks for this kind of a evaluative question, they expect for a 10 marks in particular, students to write a judgment which is in context to the case study, to show, after looking at both sides, what is your point of view or what is your own judgment about the particular question. Now this is also important even for the 20 marks question, where you need to write a better conclusion. I mean, go beyond a simple judgment to write a better detailed conclusion when it comes to a 20 mark question. So since we just talk about the 20 marks question, I think it's important for you to understand how to write a 20 mark question as well. Can we quickly discuss a little bit about some tips that are important for students, how to write a good 20 marks question?
Yeah. Now, while coming to the 20 mark question, most of the students, what they ask is, how many points should we write for analysis? How many points should we write for evaluation? Now, one thing we have to make it clear that it is not quantitative only. It depends on the quality also.
That's right. I think it's a very important thing that Edexcel always talks about. It's not just about the quantity. Like even if you write maybe 10 points or even 15 points, Edexcel would not award you the full marks just because that you have written so many points, but it all depends on how well you develop those points, how well you talk about the link strands, to talk about the causes and consequences, and like we have been talking about, context.
Yes.
So I think it's a very important point that students need to remember, especially when you talk about writing a 20 marks question. It's not about the number of points. It's all about how well you make a right balance between the quantity and quality. So remember that the quantity is also important. We are not saying that you can just write 1 or 2 lines or something like that. No, you need to make sure you have a right balance. You strike a good balance between
the quantity and
the quantity and quality. So I think that's one of the most important things. Anything else that we can talk about as important things in doing or writing a 20 marks question?
When giving the judgment also, we have to give a detailed conclusion, not as it is writing for a 10
mark question, yes. I think because they look for that sort of an analytical judgment
Yes.
or a detailed judgment, a conclusion in the 20 marks, because the question is itself for 20 marks. So in terms of, I think when you look at some of these questions that have come in the past papers of the new Edexcel IAL business papers, I see a trend that most of these 20 marks questions, not all, but most of them have a sort of a comparison.
Yeah.
Right now, which is
Yes.
not something that we had in the
In the
previous
previous
IAL
syllabus.
syllabus, where the 20 mark question, earlier we never had 20 marks for unit 1 and 2, the maximum was 14 marks, but still when you compare with that 14 mark questions of the previous IAL syllabus and the
20 mark
current
question.
20 marks, most of these questions have a tendency to students to make a kind of a comparison.
Like internal recruitment, external recruitment.
Exactly, the IKEA case study.
Yes.
Yes. So, how students need to go about that sort of a question if the question is of a comparative nature?
In that case, the students can give like
So, if you take that internal and external cases, so it will be easier to give an example. So, if you take that sort of a question, how do you think the best way students need to approach the analysis and evaluation? Because if we try to recollect that question about IKEA, it talks about the evaluative, the benefits and drawbacks of internal as well as
external
recruitment for IKEA,
Yeah.
right? So, what do you think the best way students could write an answer?
The best way actually depends on the students, but the thing is, you can give counter evaluation for this. Like internal recruitment, you can give a benefit, but however, the external recruitment is also fine. Yes.
You bring some limitation of internal recruitment before you go to the external recruitment. And then you talk about the benefits of
external recruitment, and
then
the
bring a limitation of external, and then to go to the conclusion. So I think that's something quite important for you to remember. If you get a question of that nature to compare this versus that. Now I think even in unit 2 there have been questions about sources of finance, quite a lot about bank loan versus some other source of finance, right? Yes. So keep in mind, if we go into that sort of a question, or if you are attempting, if the question is like that, to attempt in a 20 marks question, in the analysis you need to bring one side of the benefits and then bring a counter argument on evaluation, and then go to the other side, talk about the benefits, and then bring the limitations or a counter argument before you go for the final conclusion. So I think that is important for you to remember, but it's only for the questions that you get a comparative nature. But remember, if you go through the 20 marks questions of unit 1 and 2, not all these 20 marks questions have come from that kind of a comparison point of view. There have been questions about the normal structure where you need to write analysis and then to go for evaluation. So don't go or don't mix up with these two kind of questions. That is why in most of the examiner reports, examiners talk about the importance of reading the question properly, rather than coming into a conclusion of what you are going to write based on something that you have practiced before. You need to read the question quite carefully to identify what this particular question is all about, based on which the students need to answer that particular question. So when we say about the comparison questions, please keep in mind, you need to check, you need to read the question carefully, and then you need to identify whether this particular question is a question of a comparative nature, or whether the question is a normal structured question where you go with analysis and evaluation. Otherwise, you might answer a question in a wrong way, so that your 20 marks, you will not have the full marks, so you would not be able to go for higher level in terms of achieving your 20 marks. I think that is something that you need to remember, particularly when writing 20 marks. But of course, for every question, it is quite important for you to read the question carefully, and examiners always say that students should write the answer to the question given in the question, or they have given on the paper, but not to the question that they have practiced at home. So that is why it is important for you need to read the question before you write your answer. Any other tips that you think that could be useful for the students for the exam?
Now, another question that students usually ask is whether to start from section
Yes,
C or should I start from section A?
good one. Yes.
So those questions are there with the students. So what I feel is if you take more time in writing the big answers, better to go for that at the beginning. So I guess they can go to section C.
So that they won't lose the marks even if they running short of
yes,
time.
They'll be very comfortable in writing the 20-mark question at the beginning. So they can approach section C anyway. The case study will be different for each of the sections. So they can go to section C at the beginning. They can complete that within 30 minutes. And then they can move on to the section A, section B.
Okay, but keep in mind that it is not something as a prescriptive thing.
Yes.
This is just an idea.
Yeah.
Right. So different students have different styles.
It's subjective. It's subjective.
Yeah. So this is just an idea, a kind of a strategy that you can look into if you have a problem of managing your time. But remember, it's not the only method. There are different approaches that students may find it comfortable for them depending on their writing style. So you have to identify your own best approach in order to manage time. What sir has talked about is just one approach or one particular strategy for you to think about. Okay, so don't think that is the only method of writing an answer or writing the approach to the paper. It could be one thing that you can think about or one approach that you can try out to see whether you could save some time. So I think that concludes today's session. I hope that you have gained some knowledge and some of your questions have been answered successfully in this particular section or in this session. So we would hope to see you again with another teaching and a discussion section like this. So until then, have a good day and stay safe.